Major funding for Making Sense of the 60s was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Additional funding was provided by Sims Clothing Stores, where since 1960 an educated consumer has been our best customer. And by Tom's of Maine, a pioneer in natural personal care. Tom's of Maine and nature, a friendship of 20 years.
What the automobile did for America in the first half of the century, the university will do today. Clark Kerr, President, University of California.
Dear Bob, so my kid brother's high school class is beginning to think about college. Sure. I'll be glad to help you prepare a report on Michigan State. Your first friend on the faculty will probably be your enrollment officer, the person who helps you get organized at registration time. Another friend will be your counselor, who talks over your interest and background and helps you map your college program. He's available for consultation anytime during your college career when you need advice about personal problems of any kind.
I was raped in my sophomore year, and they threw me out of school. And this is 26 years ago now. And it's still a reference point in my life, and it's still very painful. And I believe this was the beginning of my personal radicalization. We all had a habit of hitchhiking. Unfortunate habit. And I was the one who it caught up with this bad habit, and I was raped. And my first reaction, being the idealistic young woman that I was to go straight to the police. And what I did not understand was that going to the police made the event public and put the university on the spot. And they forced me to leave. But my future was being taken away from me from nothing that I had done that had any malice or harm in it. Harm was done to me.
Embarrassed administrators like these were free to throw Judith Karpova out because they had absolute power. They didn't want their boat rocked. Like the rest of society, their goal was to maintain the status quo. That meant white male dominance, frequently racial and religious quotas, and trouble for people like Judith Karpova. In these old films, students look relaxed and free to do as they like. What you can't see is that they were subject to a system known as in loco parentis, in place of parents, in which administrators treated them like children. That's what parents expected.
I have never had any doubt but what Larry could do better work than what he's doing, as I said. I believe that when you get to college, you'll find out that it isn't the playtime that you have in high school. And it's up to him to find that out. And I don't believe it'll take them very long to show him that they separate the boys from the men when you get into the universities.
For most young people in 1960, college was a continuation of high school and the next step on the path to career and marriage. Any criticism of the system would have to come from someone else, like little-known songwriter Malvina Reynolds.
And the
just the same. Of course, as every girl, I have aspirations to someday be married and raise a family, and to someday be in love with someone very, very much, so that even after I'm past 30, even after I'm past 30, there's something to live for, because you have someone to give your life to, someone to do things for, to take away from the monotony of life, because as long as you're giving of yourself, you still have something to live for.
Maybe a nice home in suburbia, and some nice kids, and a beer and a ball game on a Saturday afternoon.
At Oregon State College, something new has been added. It's a student covered from head to ankle in a black bag. At first, classmates were hostile toward what appeared to be a far-out prank. The unidentified student attends only one class dressed this way. He says his idea is a testing of student conformity.
Student conformity. That described the behavior of an overwhelming majority of middle-class white college students. But there was another group that didn't conform, a group that had already begun rebelling against what society had in mind for them. They were young black students attending black colleges in the South. As the decade began, these activist black students and the mainly placid white students were scarcely aware of each other. But within 4 years, they would together bring about fundamental changes in American society. It began with a new mood in the country, a renewed desire for change. One key reason, the 1960 election of John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Absolutely clear, no question about it, that Kennedy created the general atmosphere, created a climate of high idealism. And I think, you know, in telling the story of the 60s, that would be the most important thing too. At the beginning, the idealism was evangelical. I mean, there was absolutely a sense of we will make a beautiful world, a much better world, a more humane world, a more cheerful world, a world that will be much more egalitarian than the world will be, a much more compassionate world. There was, I mean, it was marvelous.
I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. Ask not what your country can do for you.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask not, ask not, ask not, ask not, ask not what your country can do.
Ask what you can do for your country.
Ask what you can do for your country.
This is a great country, but I think it could be a greater country.
My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Country, 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 country,
There was a sense that anything was possible. Anything could happen. We were in the heels of a revolution. Everybody was talking about a better society. Here was a generation, my generation, my friends and I, who really believed we were going to live in a time in which the conditions that we saw as troubling would disappear. We could make them disappear. Maybe you couldn't do it alone, but the whole generation together could make it happen. And that was awfully, awfully exciting. So that this stream of idealism was very, very powerful.
Good evening and welcome. I'd like to start out with a real protest song.
Just as John Kennedy had touched young people with his idealistic words, Phil Oakes, Bob Dylan, and many other folk singers touched young people with their songs. And thousands of them came to coffee houses to listen to this music, which seemed to reflect their personal concerns so well.
We were in a nightmare of frozen emotional and social distances. We cut through those. We, as folk music people, may have been a little pretty absurd, you know, making believe we were chain gang convicts. But we did have deep feelings and were not afraid to talk about them and to sing about them. And remember, this was in a period where entertainment was, you know, Las Vegas, and the whole thing of the entertainer who is very good and wants to let you know how bright he is and how well he's doing is. We couldn't care less how good we were. We were our music.
Places like these, students mingled with all kinds of social outsiders, Negroes, beatniks, eccentrics, radicals. And they heard all kinds of unconventional ideas about family, school, country, and civil rights.
If you don't see me in the back of the bus, you can't find me nowhere. Oh, come on over to the front of the bus. I'll be sitting right there. I'll be sitting right there. I'll be sitting right there. Oh, come on over to the front of the bus. I'll be sitting right there.
Another critical event in the evolution of the 60s phenomena were the black student sit-ins starting in February of 1960. Black college students throughout the Upper South initially organized themselves to go to sit in at lunch counters all through the Upper South in the towns in which those colleges were located. The demonstrations were nonviolent and tremendously effective in desegregating facilities. More importantly, they were tremendously effective in suggesting what the possibilities for student activism were. And the college students black college students, as in those all-black institutions, provided the spark that revitalized the movement and ultimately provided many of the models, ideologically, tactically, etc., for white student activism later in the decade.
It was a fabulous time. It was a great time to be in college and to be black and, you know, get that sense that, hey, things are changing. We're going to change the world. And, you know, we're going to South. There were the freedom rides. There was so much happening and so many exciting things that built hope. And you said, hey, you know, America's finally going to become America.
It was almost indescribable in terms of changing my outlook on life and somehow bringing to an awareness that I can make a difference. Because as I grew up, all I knew was you do what you have to do to survive. But then, as a college student, I learned to take some risks. I remember as, it was my sophomore year, we had the first demonstration in Talladega, Alabama, and I just pulled all of my courage together and joined that march. And about 100 of us went downtown Talladega and marched around the courthouse, scared to death. Just knew we were going to get clubbed and hauled off to jail, and then I was going to have to explain to my mom and dad what I was doing down there. But I was out there on the cutting edge, and it really made me feel good. And if I hadn't been at a black college, I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have had the courage to do that.
Black students who were veterans of these actions quickly organized into the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. SNCC and other black groups attacked segregation and the deep-rooted traditions behind it with nonviolent demonstrations and protests at public facilities.
The Negro is not a part of my family. As a result, I don't elect to have him sit and eat with me. As a result, I don't elect to have him belong to a club that I may belong to. This is the way it has been. It's the history of the South. It's because we've been brought up like this. We have been taught like this. And we teach our children like this. And they'll teach their children like that. I think it is a matter that has been history all down through the years and will remain history.
The SNCC students wanted to change the history of racial segregation, and they thought the time had come because of their sit-in successes. They believed that willpower alone could wipe out the entire system of American apartheid. That's how optimistic, or how naive, or how determined they were. They and the other civil rights groups divided up the South so each could concentrate on one area.
We claim Mississippi as our own. Young, foolish, dumb, really. We said, we're going to go in here, we're going to break this place open. And our theory was that if we brought down Mississippi, the rest of the South would have to fall. Because this was the worst of the places. And how would we bring it down? We would flood the state with black and white students and so overpower it with our nonviolence and our freedom schools that it would not be able to resist. And then the rest of the South would look and say, oh, look what those students did in Mississippi, over here in Tennessee and Virginia, we better watch out. And we thought it would all come tumbling down. It didn't quite happen that way. But I tell you, it wasn't a bad theory.
You put that date right there. If you were born here in Dallas and Boca Chili, you would put date of your birth.
What did Eleanor Holmes Norton and her SNCC colleagues intend to do in Mississippi? To register as many black voters as they could, because they believed that with enough black voters, they could defeat the laws and the leaders that kept segregation alive. Their effort began with organizing.
We'll be more than glad to arrange transportation for you to get down there today if you can't go on your own.
Our position was we had to get people to crack through the fear, and that had to be done on a one-to-one basis, and it had to be we had to make sure that we were talking to people about their own self-interest, because we never lied to someone and said, look, there's no harm in this. Your name's not going to be published in the newspaper, and if the sheriff comes at you, we will protect you. We couldn't do that.
They could stick a dynamite right through this window here in this church.
I sure hope, people around the world will respond to it so we don't die for nothing. Okay, let's move. Let's have some volunteers up here so Larry can set up this workshop. We shall
Thousands of young black people were learning the theory and practice of nonviolence. They had to be taught because nonviolence isn't the way people normally react to intimidation. They had to learn to hold their tempers, whatever the provocation.
This young man really isn't protected at all. His hands ought to be over his head. He should be protected. He's doing a good thing. Notice, he went down here to protect his brother down here, his sister. This young lady under here is being protected by him. But also, he didn't really protect her as well as he could be, as well as he could have. For one, this young lady here is exposed. Her head is all left open. These signs, you can drop these signs and police will start to beat you. Immediately cover your head. You have to curl up. Now this young lady, her most important part is her head and her internal section. Her internal section is protected, but her head isn't, because it's right here. His elbow is over it. So get up a second. I'll show you. Now you stay here and lie across this way. No, across her head. No, the way I'm standing. That's right. This is the way he should lie in order to protect her. Now, she is well protected. In order to protect himself, cross your legs. So they can't jab a stick in between your legs and hurt you. Now his head's protected. He's all right. Now, you've got to be careful not to suffocate the person underneath. But when times are difficult, these are the methods that you have to use. Now, she has to curl up a little more and put your head right against his body. Now, this group is still fairly well protected, even though she feels a little weight. She's not feeling anyone hitting her with a stick. So this can be these are very effective techniques in this whole idea of school of nonviolence.
Here I had been raised with guns all my life. I'd been shooting since I was 10 years old, And quite frankly, by now I've even shot at a few folk, But the workshops, they would do workshops every night with people who wanted to help work with the project. And I can remember them being very heavy into it, the nonviolent question. I mean, the whole history of Gandhi. It was started with Gandhi. And the whole history. And then you had so many preachers running around. Everybody was a reverend in them days, or wanted to be a preacher. So they were connected with Jesus. So you had Jesus, you had Gandhi, you had Martin Luther King, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And still, I'm looking at all these accomplishments and saying they did this with nonviolence? This is unbelievable. So it was like total acceptance. Let's do it if it works like that.
Despite their nonviolence, the civil rights workers were being attacked, and they were not getting the protection they had asked for from the Kennedy administration. John Kennedy was concerned enough to speak out against the violence, but he did nothing concrete to prevent it, because he was afraid to anger Southern Democrats.
He was trying to play both ends against the middle. He had been elected by a very narrow margin, and he wanted to be reelected in '64, and he knew he couldn't be reelected in '64 if he came to be overly identified with either party to the struggle. Now, I do think genuinely he came to be moved and to learn a heck of a lot about the civil rights struggle and to be ultimately quite committed to it by the end of his life. But he was in no way the catalyst for what occurred in the 60s.
John Kennedy didn't think the civil rights struggle was his most pressing problem. His greatest worry was communism, the Soviet Union, and the possibility of nuclear war.
The real problem is the Soviet desire to expand their power and influence. If Mr. Khrushchev would concern himself with the real interests of the people of the Soviet Union, that they have a higher standard of living, protect his own security, there's no real reason why the United States and the Soviet Union, separated by so many thousands of miles of land and water, both rich countries, both with very energetic people, should not be able to live in peace. It's the combination of these two systems in conflict around the world in a nuclear age is what makes the 60s so dangerous.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest America has ever come to atomic destruction, shook up many Americans, especially young Americans, just as they had been shaken by the violent reaction to civil rights protesters.
We thought, why do we have to be afraid of dying? Are we really going to die? Is there really going to be a nuclear war? And why do we have to think about this? This is too big for us. I remember the absolutely stunned hush. I remember the sense of wanting to stay indoors, of being actually afraid to walk outside, not because something was going to fall from the sky at this particular moment, but because the sense of crisis was so intense and our unpreparedness for it and our sense of being afflicted with it was so intense that you did not want to walk alone out under that sky.
And television was bringing home other distressing realities.
I think we in the Midwest had been sheltered from what was happening in the South, what was happening in the black community in the South. And when television came on the horizon, we weren't sheltered anymore. And we saw what human beings were doing to each other. And it was really very shocking, very hurtful.
One of the most memorable events of the 60s and a high point in the civil rights struggle.
I couldn't believe that many people were there. I just assumed I would walk right up front and just sit there and listen. And boy, when he stopped, it's sort of like history stopped for a moment and looked down and said, hey, watch what's going to happen now. And you knew you were on a roll when you left Washington that day. You knew something had happened. We brought an army down here, and America was going to have to change. God damn it, America was going to have to change, and you knew it. And unlike all the other bullcrap that I had participated in my life, where you could sit up endlessly as we did in college and do your sophomore-ish philosophy, and then you get out of the dorm at 6:30 in the morning and nothing changed. When you came home from Washington, it started to change.
America was heading into unknown territory in which a way of life was changing and 100-year-old social customs were breaking up. The country badly needed a captain it could follow. And for most Americans in late 1963, especially young Americans, that man was John Kennedy. His words had stirred a generation and motivated many to action. Maybe he'd been slow to fully support civil rights, but now he seemed ready to push ahead. Then, suddenly...
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
here was a guy that our parents put into power, who we could dig and love and trusted. I think the key word is trust. We trusted JFK, and we relied upon him. And when he got assassinated, there was a terrible, awful, violent wrenching of our souls. And we said, how could you do this to him? How could you let this happen to him? And there was a slamming of a door.
This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best.
At first, nobody really knew what kind of president Lyndon Baines Johnson would be, or what he hoped to accomplish. He had a reputation as a tough, old-line politician, a wheeler-dealer. But when he announced his goals, they turned out to be as idealistic as his predecessors.
And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
The Johnson of '63 was astonishing. There was more energy in the man. There was more personal interest. And there was more sincerity about poverty and so forth. And I began quickly to distinguish him from the Kennedys. This man had known poverty and he had known poor people. It was not an abstraction to him. It was in his gut.
President Johnson achieved what JFK could not, the passage of the Civil Rights Bill. Proud of his accomplishment, he appealed directly to his fellow Southerners to comply with the law.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice.
If you were a black person living in the South, especially in Mississippi, the passage of the Civil Rights Act didn't change your life much. The young people of SNCC, registering black voters, continued to confront racism. And although it didn't kill their idealism, fear and intimidation did keep black voter registration to less than 5%. As the summer of 1964 approached, SNCC leaders knew their efforts were in danger of collapsing. After an angry debate, they voted, just barely, to try a risky new strategy, importing large numbers of northern white students to work with them. They hoped this would focus the nation's attention on their efforts and keep the racists at bay. That strategy would have momentous results for all America. Of the many northern white students who had been touched by the southern black drama, about 1,000 signed up for training sessions at a small women's college in Oxford, Ohio.
I remember when I arrived at the Oxford orientation session of the Freedom Summer, I guess I had never been around that many African Americans, or black people, as people were saying then. There had been, a few people in my life in school, like one or two people, tokens. There I was, the first day, in the midst of a group of people who seemed to me better and brighter than all those people I'd been spending time at Harvard, and they were black. It was incredible that I went from mildly thinking that black people, because of certain historical conditions, were still somewhat inferior to whites, almost like this overnight, to thinking that black people were more advanced, actually, or at least these black intellectuals. who were involved were more advanced than white people. It was a total inversion of my former reality.
The white students had been told what was waiting for them in Mississippi. They had been trained to deal with it. They'd seen examples of it on television. Still, they were shocked at the hatred they found.
It's like, as soon as you step over that line, there is no middle ground, and you're one of them, but if you're not one of them, then you're a nigger lover. And suddenly you're the object of hate, and when you feel that full force for the first time, it is, you're never the same again, ever. And starting to understand a thin line between hearkening once back to what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in certain milieus and within a society at large. And if you step over what is acceptable, then you're expendable. And in some cases, in 1964, any place in the South, you're literally expendable.
People should expect to get beaten. They should expect to spend in jail, and it may go beyond the summer when they're in jail, and that they should expect possibly somebody to get killed.
3 civil rights workers from another group, the Congress of Racial Equality, vanished even before most of the Freedom Summer volunteers had left Ohio. Andrew Goodman, Mickey Schwerner, and James Chaney. The discovery of their mutilated bodies shocked the nation. For the first time, white children had also died fighting Southern racism. No other single event brought home to whites, students and parents alike, the seriousness of the civil rights struggle. This tragedy had the unexpected effect of protecting SNCC's Freedom Summer volunteers, since it brought in the national news media. With TV cameras focused on them, most racists backed away from overt violence, and SNCC students managed to register more black voters than ever.
Our confidence is a mile high. I mean, because we've gone 4 years now. We've gone into some of the worst situations and come out of them living. We've made them back up off of us in the worst kinds of situations. We don't believe nothing can happen to us. And even when those kids from CORE died in Neshoba County, we kept that vision and was able to explain to people, because the volunteers were still intact. We hadn't put them in the street yet. And we said, this is because they did not obey the instructions. Because they did not. Never do you ride the road at night in an integrated car. That was the instructions in orientation. And if you do, you never stop for anybody, ever. Even if it's the police, he follow you home where other people can witness you. And by now, we had put two-way radios in the cars. They hadn't got that installed. But nevertheless, by now, we don't believe it's possible for them to stop us.
The black people of Mississippi and the students who had helped them register were confident enough now to make a bid for national power. They formed their own party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP, and they elected their own integrated slate of delegates to go to the 1964 Democratic Convention set for August in Atlantic City. Their intention was to take the seats of the all-white Mississippi delegation.
As the Democratic Party delegates gather in Atlantic City, all the hoopla that is a byproduct of a party convention begins to build. What will the Democrats do without this fellow on hand?
The young activists of the Freedom Democratic Party stormed into Atlantic City, filled with the fervor of Freedom Summer, convinced their energy and commitment would carry them to victory. But they ran headlong into party regulars who expected to nominate Lyndon Johnson without a civil rights floor fight, sure to anger white Southern delegates.
We were confronted by a guy named Lyndon Johnson, who opened the FBI on us, who had all of us tapped, who looked at all of our personal lives in a file, and who then told Hubert Humphrey and Mondale that if you want to be vice president, you got to stop those niggas. Because we'd had commitments from delegates throughout the country that we will support the seating of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party because they are the true Democrats. Well, one lady from California was told, if you don't change your vote, your husband won't be a federal judge. So we found that when you really put the political system to test, it failed.
The defeat in Atlantic City was a bitter end to Freedom Summer for many black activists. But for white students, Freedom Summer was just the beginning. When the white volunteers returned in that fall of 1964, they were no longer innocent idealists. They were political activists, determined to use what they had learned to fight racism wherever they found it. But the colleges they returned to were the same as they had been in 1960. Administrators were still practicing in loco parentis. They still felt they had the right to control students' lives. But that right was about to be challenged.
So these veterans came back, and what they wanted to do was have their SNCC table, and we were sending money in support groups, money, and recruiting to go south. Recruiting, the tables were to recruit, set up, where everybody set up their tables, were to recruit money and to recruit bodies, and to convince people. And it was really like, you know, in older times, I guess, supporting missionary work of your church. If you know, this was your church, and there were missionaries who went out to save people. But it had that fervor.
As soon as student activity started growing, the university started trying to push the activity off campus. We couldn't use the rooms. We couldn't talk in the middle of the campus. We couldn't do anything. We got shoved to the very edge of campus, to this little row of dinky card tables where people came out and set up with their earnest cans and their smudgy mimeographed leaflets, you know, and saying, listen, there's a little demonstration in the city, you know, here's where the carpool leaves, you know, would you like to join our club, and please give us 25 cents so we can print up some more stuff. And the university said, you can't do even this. And we went nuts, because they were stomping on the only thing that was of meaning to us.
This was next to God. This was holy. This was the holy war in America. And if you stop it here, if you say we have no right to do that, then you're bankrupt. This is really bad, because this is priority number one. This is the main moral battlefield.
We are lectured out 2 hours a day, 2 hours a week in a particular course.
Former Freedom Summer volunteers may have been among the first to start questioning university policies, but their spirit was contagious, and their numbers grew quickly.
How you're meant to teach, what you're meant to do, how you even hold the chalk.
You can't have any kind of personal dialogue with the teacher if you're in a class with 400 people. It's impossible.
And it is here where the rules destroy what should be the aim of the university.
They actually give the United States Constitution to kids to read in school. It's just unbelievable. These kids are going to take this stuff seriously, you know? Right.
It's not just that they tell us what hour we can get back into the dorms like we're little children. It's they don't teach us about the things we want to learn about. We want to know why the society runs the way it does. Okay? We want someone to come in and teach us about the foundations of racism in the society, but there's no courses about racism. Hey, we'd like a course on racism. There's no way you can get a course on racism, okay? It's not just that there aren't any black teachers to teach it, right? It's just there's no place in the social sciences curriculum for something like this, and there's no mechanism for the people who are doing the learning to ask, give me what I want to learn about.
We'll do something which hasn't occurred at this university in a good long time. We're going to have real classes up there. But There are going to be freedom schools conducted up there. We're going to have classes on First and 14th Amendments.
Something extraordinary was happening at the Berkeley campus of the University of California. Formerly docile students were defying the rules and regulations, and they didn't seem to care about the consequences.
The fourth, third, and second floors are filled. Stay downstairs.
If you were a college administrator, this was absolutely incomprehensible.
I am Dr. Edward Strong, Chancellor of the Berkeley campus. I have an announcement. This assemblage has developed to such a point that the purpose and work of the university have been materially impaired.
We could disrupt them plenty and make life uncomfortable for them. And it was the beginning of seeing and feeling that you could matter in concert with other people. And that, oh my God, you know, it was very heady stuff.
Mr. Keystone, would you care to leave the building at this time without being arrested? No, thank you. You are under arrest, sir. Would you care to submit voluntarily to arrest and walk out of here with a policeman?
Well, I'm a little tired, that's all.
And I assume you want us to carry you out, is that right?
Well, yeah, I'm tired.
All right, you are the 117th person to be arrested here this morning.
These were no longer just the students who had gone to Mississippi during Freedom Summer. They were students who had been inspired by the words of John Kennedy. They were students who had listened to Phil Oakes and Bob Dylan and heard echoes of their own hopes and concerns. They were students who had admired the young blacks that sat down at Southern luncheonette counters. They were students who lived through and had been shaken by the Cuban Missile Crisis. They were thousands of students who unexpectedly realized that their innermost feelings were inseparably connected to the way they lived their lives, and that some things were worth fighting for.
And suddenly, at that instant historically, the traditional spectrum of politics, which had been all exterior, it suddenly was healed and made whole, and we started to understand, oh, the interior matters too. It matters to connect our feelings to our ideas. It matters to treat each other right when we're doing politics. Because if we're not kind to each other, if we aren't making in what we're doing the thing that we want to build, then anything we could build is gone. This was the trouble of the Stalinist left. They treated each other terribly. They treated each other terribly for the sake of an idea, and we're not going to do that, okay? This, you know, all the interior, all the feelings started to open up. Oh, you mean being a woman and being a man, this is political, how I feel as a woman and a man? You mean my sexual impulses, this is political material? You mean the way I take my leisure and what I do with my entertainment time and whether I have to look forward to a life that's going to make me commute 2 hours every day on the choking freeway and never get home to see my children as a father? You mean this is political material? You mean the spiritual impulses I have, these inklings? You know, I smoked the marijuana and I lay on the grass, and suddenly I realized the grass is alive. The grass has a spirit. You mean this is political? This is political? What a mind blower! What a mind blower!
The defiant protests at Berkeley were only the start of a youth rebellion that was soon to sweep through high schools and colleges throughout America, and in fact, throughout the world. The rebels had begun by questioning society's right to keep black people down. But now they began to question any institution, any authority, any rule that prevented people from controlling their own lives. If these rebels had a single unifying message, it was this: the world needs changing, and we are ready and willing to take on the job.
Major funding for Making Sense of the 60s was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Additional funding was provided by Sims Clothing Stores, where since 1960 an educated consumer has been our best customer. And by Tom's of Maine, a pioneer in natural personal care. Tom's of Maine and nature, a friendship of 20 years.
Video cassettes of this program can be purchased for educational use only by calling 1-800-328-PBS1. Home video sales are not available through this offer.
This is PBS. For a printed transcript of this program, send $5 to 60s Transcript, Journal Graphics, 267 Broadway, New York, New York, 10007. To order by credit card, call 212-227-READ.
There's nothing wrong with just sex for sex.
The 60s. Were they just sex, drugs, and rock and roll?
I took a hit of Osley White Lightning acid, and I became an instant hippie.
A lot of people did not understand long hair at all. It was really a threat to them.
From the Summer of Love to Woodstock, the largest youth rebellion in our history would shake the foundations of middle-class morality.
There's no doubt that people were having an awful lot more sex.
But as for the real fact of how we lived was food stamps.
Every day in our work, they walk the streets and they steal all things.
That's not true.
The parents want you to make money, go to school, have a nice job. I want to have a nice job.
Who's going to work? Who's going to grow the food?
You don't have to go. Where do you end up? Because I have a son that's going to go into the army.
Don't miss the next episode of Making Sense of the 60s.